But speaking of something that maybe needed a laugh track, so kind of one of the big things going on this week is that we have a new movie that came out last weekend, kind of a new faith-based movie. A lot of people are talking about it, The Forge, which I reviewed, and there's plenty for us to get into. I think this is a rich topic because I think it is again using the movie itself to sort of talk about it, but not necessarily just only focusing on that, because I think it leads to just bigger questions about, hey, how do we evaluate art? Like as Christians, like how do we sort of navigate this? What makes it good? What makes it bad? Is there approaches that we should be, what should we look for with movies? So we'll get into that. I do want to report that I was actually looking snazzy. It was my wife liked it because it meant I had to take off my hat and I actually dress up in like a blazer. But I had the opportunity to be at the premiere of Forge, walking the red carpet.
Do you feel more famous now? Like were people trying to take your photos?
I mean, like, the paparazzi was there, and kind of looking like, hey, is that who I think it is? Is that the host of the Faith and Pop Culture podcast?
It is.
Could
you move out of the way? There's a guy right behind you. I'd really like to photograph.
Mr. Kendrick Brothers, step aside. We want to interview. But it was fun. That was the first time that, again, we live over here in Georgia, so not that I would be invited anyways, but like most of the premieres happen over in like LA, area. Yeah. This one is in Atlanta, our own stomping grounds, and it was cool. I think if you've seen my review already and the conversation we're about to have, I wasn't crazy about this movie by any means. I was a little self-conscious walking the red carpet, knowing that I had a negative review floating out there in the internet. But it is cool, and I think I always, regardless of what I think of their product, their art, it's cool and interesting to me to hear from Christian creators. Because the Kendrick Brothers, they had like a Q&A after the screening, and like Priscilla Schreier, who's big name woman speaker, she was an actress in the movie, and she was sharing and just asking questions about the film. And I don't know, I like that kind of stuff. I think it's important.
Yeah, no, I think it's neat to go to and to see and experience.
And it just sort of reminds you too that like there's people on the other side of this. Like maybe that's helpful even as me as a reviewer of not that necessarily, I did make sure to get my review done before I went, because I don't want to necessarily be colored by, I wanted to be honest and not, because there's things to be honest about. So enough about me looking snazzy in my blazer on the red carpet.
We'll see if you can, if you send me a photo, we can maybe add that to the...
Yeah, right here, you can see myself in my blazer. But I think The Forge, this is an interesting movie because I think it's a very, I don't know about divisive, but it's just one that,
well, there seems to be a dividing line between those who love it and those who could care less about it.
Yeah, or even actively dislike like it. And I feel like the dividing line is about at 50 years old. Again, if you're younger or older than that and you don't fall in, that's fine. It's not a hard rule, but anecdotally, that sort of being this is sort of a movie that feels made by sort of the older generation. For the older generation.
You can say boomer if you want to.
Hashtag okay boomer. But so I do think there is sort of a generational thing. But what makes these movies tricky sometimes is that there's really no other movies in Hollywood like this. I think you hear people will make the comments hey, movies have messages all the time. Hollywood, they're always having these messages and agendas. It's fine if Christians have a movie that's very sort of message first. And it's just not the case. It is the case that Hollywood movies have messages and there's themes and there's stuff sometimes even overt kind of messages that come through. What I think is different with a movie like The Forge is to me at least, this isn't a movie with a message. This is a message that's communicated through a movie. This isn't just, hey, here's a story, a true story or something, or telling it and inspirational. And we sort of want to emphasize this aspect of the character's journey and touch on these themes that I think are relevant. This is very much as I heard directly from them, in the Q&A, we wanted to talk, to communicate about the importance of discipleship and sort of what that means and sort of hear these steps. And we sort of need to just sort of get a story that allows us to do that.
Or doesn't, and tell it anyways.
Or at least attempt to do that. So very much this is a message. This is a sermon. This is, you're going to, hey, Wednesday night church this week is going to be held in the AMC movie theater. To me, that's what that is. And sort of where this gets interesting is that okay? And how do you, because it's such in a way that no other films are intertwined with you got the movie, you got the message, and they're the same thing almost. Like,
Yeah.
the message is the movie is the message. So like, how do you approach that? Like, how do you, is it possible to like critique it and not, like, and still love Jesus? Like, can you be like pro message or what the message is, but like anti the medium, the vehicle used to communicate it is terrible, but I like the message. Like, and I've just sort of seen, even with some like the discussion with my review and stuff, is like Christians have a hard time with that. Of,
Yeah.
like, like almost shock that like I didn't love this movie, even though I love a lot of faith-based movies. It's like, well, like, but it was so powerful. Like, this is the message we need. We need stories about this topic. And it's like, well, I think we do. Like, so it's just sort of this messy thing. And I think kind of the question that we can dive into this is just that I've been thinking about is this like, can well-meaning, solid Christian artists still make bad art? Like,
Definitely.
well, see, I wish more people. But so, what do you think about it? Like, can you? Because like, obviously, I think this movie is well-intentioned.
Well, I think like anybody can make bad art, so like, I think it almost doesn't matter the message behind your art, or even that, does art, even have a message? I mean, it certainly can. And so I think it really doesn't even matter like the religious perspective that someone's like coming from, like they can still make a really bad piece of art. And I think what's tricky though is with film, there's so much latitude in how you can make something and still call it a film. Like there's not really like the film police necessarily, except maybe the critics that say like this, when do you go from propaganda to like a film? Like where's that? And there's not really super clear. And I think that's why these things can get so messy and why people can really cling on to like, no, if you love Jesus, then you will have to like this movie. Whereas I think if like apply that to any other medium and it falls apart.
Yeah,
and so that's what I think is more tricky with this.
That's what I've sort of been thinking about, like sort of equivalents of the ones that have come to my mind are like, think of a very like technically sloppy, very amateurish painting of Jesus hanging on the cross. Like, is that painting powerful or is it not? And I feel like how you sort of approach a movie like The Forge might depend like how you approach, like, is it powerful because it's about Jesus on the cross, and like Jesus on the cross is powerful and that's a beautiful thing even if the painting itself is horrible? Or is it like, no, that's a bad work of art, and like not only is it like, just not good, but like it's almost worse because it's dealing with a topic that should be treated with more excellence and reverence. Like,
Yeah.
if you're going to do Jesus on the cross, like it should be, or like the other equivalent would be like, singing Amazing Grace, like a special music, like me singing it, and like, tone deaf, horrible voice. No one wants me singing. Like, is it powerful because the words about Amazing Grace and like God's amazing grace is beautiful, and I get moved when I think about, in my own life, the amazing grace of God.
It's powerful, but not in the way.
Yeah, it definitely moves people emotionally. Or is it like, can you also be like, okay, like, God bless you, you love Jesus, but you're not the one that should be singing special music. Like, that's not, how you performed it isn't a good quality. And we can say that without necessarily criticizing, like, so you're saying you don't believe in God's amazing grace. Like, no, I do. I just don't think I should be the one on stage singing that. And I feel like we do acknowledge that in, like you said, in some of the other arts. That like, hey, you can have the message, or the topic, the subject. You can have the art, and like you almost treat those as two separate things. Like, just because not every painting in the history of Western society that has featured Jesus is a good painting. Like, lots of them are bad. Lots of them are amateurish, and we can say that without. But for some reason, I don't really know why. With movies, it's almost like, well, this is about Jesus, and I love the message, so we should support it. And it's weird if you don't support it, and I feel like we almost get tricked by it. Of like, because like it may move us in some way, but like, is it because the movie is done in such a way with excellence and like crafted that it moves us, or is it just this is sort of invoking a different feeling I have apart from the movie, and I believe discipleship is powerful, and I wish we had more of that, and I'm pumped up now. But is that because of the movie, or just because of like your own personal beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. Like because it's movies like this are so, I guess, sentimental that it touches people who care about these themes are going to be touched by it. Well, some people who care about these themes are going to be touched by it, because it has, for some reason it evokes in them their own thoughts on and their own feelings about discipleship or whatever the theme may be. And because it stirs you that way, you're given to be more, or you're given to be less critical of the way in which it was put together and the quality of the actual movie. And it's a strange thing because it seems to kind of be the only area in which we just give a blatant pass, or some Christians, maybe a lot of Christians, give a pass for the actual medium and say, well, either that doesn't matter, it never occurred to them that it mattered, or it shouldn't matter because the message is so good that, again, if you put the shoe on the other foot and say, if this was just a totally left-wing agenda-driven movie, like how would you feel about that? And it would be like, this is a bad movie.
Well, even less extreme. Like, I think if you just make the kid in the Forge a Mormon, or whatever, a Buddhist or something, like just another, and then you have the same thing about this story in this religious community, and they help, like, I feel like most Christians would be like, this isn't a good movie, this is just preaching, because a lot of the critiques you hear about Hollywood, we essentially make that movie with things like this. Like, this is Hollywood just, they need to just tell good stories. It's not about pushing these agendas and messages, and then we go and like make movies that are like more agenda-driven, message-driven than like anything else found in Hollywood. But it's okay because it sort of makes us feel good because we like the message. Like, it's a good sermon. We amen the sermon, and because we feel that way, maybe we are less likely to like even at all stop to think like, okay, but like there's no 3-act tension. Like the dialogue wasn't crisp. Like there's like about 45 minutes in this movie where nothing happens beyond dialogue. Like, or the filmmakers, they're not, everything they communicate is through a character telling you, like, which is like the cardinal sin of storytelling. Like, you don't learn things about these characters by seeing them in action, like in their life. You learn it because the camera's close in on their face and I'm just struggling with this because of this, and I need to overcome this. Like, it's just telling you, like, which is just not, regardless of it's Christian, like, it's just not good storytelling. But I feel like because what they're saying, because we almost go into like church mode of like, oh, we're used to people just preaching to us. And it's sort of the idea that I feel like art has a language. Like, I think the example I gave in the review was like a PowerPoint where like you have, sort of the classic of like, you have like an older person maybe that wants to, like, kids these days, they're visual, it's a visual generation. Like, so instead of just lecturing, or a professor or something, like, I'm going to have a PowerPoint of visuals. And then there's just like bullet point text, like, no pictures, just, and it's sort of,
and then they read from that text.
And then they just sort of, and it's like, well, like, I'm appealing to them because this generation is moved by, and that's kind of the idea of like, what I feel like these sort of films are doing. It's like, hey, people are moved by films. Like, films are powerful, art's powerful, but it never embraces like the actual like language of film. Like, in the same way that like just picking up instruments and like randomly hitting notes isn't going to appeal to people because, hey, people love music. It's like there's a language to music. There's harmonies. There's notes that don't go together and notes that do go together. There's chords. Like, there's structures. Like, there's things about music that you also have to understand. Like, it's not just, as long as I got a guitar, like the kids like going to rock and roll concerts, like, so I'm just going to hit open strings on my guitar and appeal to them. Like, no, there has to be a sense that you understand how this art form works. And I feel like with movies like The Forge, to me, it's sort of taking, hey, people like going to the movie theater, people like movies are shaping us, so we need to counterbalance that, but it's not actually grasping any of the things that appeal to people through movies. Like, it's it doesn't treat it as a movie. It treats it as like it's a mere vehicle.
Yeah, and I think movies like this really showcase that, and I think it's because I think partly movies can be such a very technical art form because like you have to get the lights right, there's camera, there's so many elements to making a movie that it can like present as a movie when in fact it really isn't a movie. And I think it then gives the choir, which is the church that goes and pays for this movie, the false sense that this movie is doing what all the other movies are doing in Hollywood, and it is a counterbalance, when in fact all it's doing is just affirming what the choir already feels, and nobody outside the choir is going to go and see the movies. But everyone in the choir is so excited because this is going to like impact people outside the choir.
Well, and I think the reason why it doesn't is like if the movie, like if the emotional beats and stuff, like the fact that makes it powerful, if that is just sort of reminding Christians of something outside of the movie, like, because Jesus as a person, as God, Son of God, because that fills you with emotion and you have that connection, like someone talking about Jesus in the scene is going to make you feel some of that, even though the scene itself isn't exciting, like because it's invoking that. But like if you're someone that doesn't have that like those frames of reference, having a character just talk to you for a 6-minute dialogue scene, like if that's not stirring your emotions about something else, then like
that's really boring.
Then it's not stirring anything. Then it's not at all powerful. Like I think because we're the choir, we can get tricked into thinking like this is such a powerful, because we're bringing so much of other like background experiences in church and like our own Christian walk like to the table, and assuming that anyone else seeing this movie is going to have the same experience,
right?
Because I was so emotional because I remember when I was discipled by Pastor Joe, and I said, well, like this 18-year-old kid that has never been to church, like, are they going to be moved by it the same way? No, like, unless the movie itself is powerful. And that's kind of the last thing I would just say for this is like, doesn't like should Christians just like bite their tongue? Because like like there is this sort of sense that like for someone like me to like give it a negative review is like almost as like I'm a turncoat, like like how dare you, like shouldn't we just like support, we need more Christian films, like,
Judas.
Because even at the premiere there was some sense of like them telling us and the movies they're going to be sharing the theater with it like definitely aren't elevating God, and like sort of this idea that I support this because
it's because it's the lone voice that's speaking.
Like a
for
ticket
truth.
for the forge is like a ticket for building the kingdom of God.
And I think the counter to that is no, it isn't. It's not the only option that Christians have now, and it's not the only faith-based movie. Like there's lots of actually good faith-based movies now, and I think that is where like maybe back in the day when it was like maybe the first faith-based film to go into theaters or whatever, it was a big deal, and like, hey, okay, you can get behind it, and like, hey, we need to see more of this. But this far into the game, it's like, yeah, but there's a lot of people doing this now, and we're getting faith-based movies like all the time.
Well, I think like with the exception of maybe horror, like I don't think there's a genre, if you consider faith-based like a genre, like I don't think there's one that has more movies this year than faith-based. Like there's more faith-based films than there is comic book movies, even though like they're not as big budget or like
sure.
They don't reach as many people maybe, but like as far as this quantity, like you're getting one of these every couple of weeks, like faith-based. Like so I do feel like some of the marketing gimmick of just like if you really want people to the nation to turn to God, go buy a ticket for your all your friends, and like some of that I don't know, I get a little squeamish about the marketing aspect, but I do think like Christian, like bad movies are released all the time by secular movie makers, and Christians are humans, and Christians can make good movies, Christians can make bad movies.
Yeah.
But I feel like the sort of the reluctance to be honest about some of these, and like that you have to sort of like dance on eggshells to say, well, like I love the message in Jesus, but like it's kind of a bad movie. Like
yeah.
Some of I think because we have done that for so long, like is why we still get movies like this. Like it's there's no incentive then if it's just like anything that has like all my favorite movies are the ones that perfectly align with my views, and if anything that comes out about Jesus, I gotta support this. I gotta say it's amazing. No critical thinking. Like I may be very critical about Hollywood films, but like for these films, turn that part off of the brain. Like I feel like you need to have honest conversations about art, because I feel like movies representing God and like Christ and stuff should be good. Like,
Yeah.
there's more at stake there than a bad comic book movie where you just say whatever, it's just a comic book movie. Like, if it's a movie that's sort of gonna give people a picture of like the church and God, like we better make sure those are good. And you're not gonna get that by like being so squeamish about like saying maybe we could have done a little more thought put into like how we structure this movie, or like this long dialogue scene. Like, maybe there's a better way to do it than just have a character literally sit in church services and have a pastor preach to him. Like, maybe there's different ways to communicate the message. That's a bit more relatable to those outside of the church. But hey, let us know if I'm just way too grumpy and just need to love Jesus a bit more and support these types of movies. But I do think, as this in general, the church just isn't very, I guess, educated, or like we haven't been pushed to think critically about art and films as much as just a movie that has a message I affirm good, message I don't affirm bad, and that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
And I feel like as the church, we need to be a bit more engaged when it comes to film.